report. Okay, thank you, Dr. Walker. My first question is generally, what is your title? What do you do on a kind of monthly to yearly basis with respect to coastal dune systems?
Sure. I'm Ian Walker. I'm a professor of geography at the University of California, Santa Barbara recently, and an adjunct professor at Arizona State University. I am a geomorphologist by training, which means I study Earth's surface processes and landforms. And in particular, I'm most interested in sediment transport and erosion processes, as you know. Mostly those by wind, but also those by wave action on beaches. So I spend a lot of time on beaches and sand dunes. I have worked on river systems in the past and floodplains and so on. Even done a little bit of work on glaciers and past environmental reconstructions. But really, when it comes to dune restoration, I think the realm that we're talking about is what I would call applied geomorphology, wherein we take the science of understanding erosion and the resulting geomorphic responses to that. So for example, dune erosion or beach erosion and lowering and sediment losses that are associated with that, or the rebuilding of those beaches and dunes, and trying to understand that erosion and rebuilding regime, both in natural settings, but in the case of dune restoration, in settings that have been disturbed. They could have been disturbed by changes to the sediment budget. So somebody's taken sediment away, or a river system's been dammed or diverted, and that reduces sediment supply that will eventually starve beaches and dunes, and thus they have a response to that is often erosional. Or in the case of the project you've been working on in Humboldt Bay, California, invasive vegetation was introduced to the region. And that vegetation, which lives on and forms the dunes, has changed their function and their form. And so when we think about ecosystems and ecosystem restoration, one of the key things or targets that we're focused on is form and function. And so if we think about beaches and the dunes that they feed and create, we have to think about what should that system look like. And this is where the geomorphology comes in, and less so the biology. Not that the biology is not important, of course. Without the vegetation, we don't get coastal dunes like foredunes. But trying to understand how it is that an invasive plant species can change the amount of sediment that moves, the timing of that sediment movement, how much is stored on the dune, and that's what we call morphodynamics. So how the system can maintain its form in a balanced state in terms of a sediment budget versus being eroded rapidly. So in a nutshell, that's kind of what my role is as a geomorphologist in dune restoration, but I do work with ecologists. And in that example, the Fish and Wildlife Service of the United States, but I've worked with other parks agencies and even kind of municipal or private landholder groups to kind of help them understand and manage for dune restoration. And the ultimate goal of this is to try and take the system back to a form that's a little more balanced in terms of how it can respond and adjust to things like coastal erosion and storm forcing. So if we think about this morphodynamics concept again, and we think about erosion and rebuilding regimes, or the frequency and magnitude of events that cause those things, erosion and rebuilding, restoration aims to try and bring that back into more of a natural balance, with the idea that natural systems are accustomed to erosion. They will rebuild fairly quickly, which makes them resilient, and that those systems that are disturbed either directly by humans or by modification to the sediment budget or by changes in vegetation are not as resilient. So the goal then is to try and bring the system back to a more resilient state, a more natural state.
You mentioned that, go ahead.
Does that answer that question?
Oh, absolutely, yes. You had mentioned that you kind of started off in fluvial systems, and I know you've worked on some geoarchaeology projects, but what initially got you into working on coastal dune systems or aeolian geomorphology in general?
Yeah, right, good question. So my undergrad was on river systems and how they form and create floodplains. So these are areas alongside the river that store sediments that are transported and deposited by the river. That's when I got the bug for geomorphology and research, because I did an honors thesis at the University of Toronto. And then I knew, it's like, I really like this research process. I'm fascinated by rivers. I like trying to understand longer term evolution of landscapes using our understanding of the processes and the responses, whether it be deposition or creation of landforms. So that's when I got the bug, and I wanted to stay in river systems. When I applied for graduate school, I applied to lots of places, as you're doing, I'm sure, to keep on studying rivers. And turns out the opportunity that was most appealing was to work in desert systems and still work on a fluid, but in this case, air, not water, and do some desert geomorphology work, which I was pretty fascinated by because I hadn't much training in that. It was a new area. It seemed kind of exotic because I get to go to deserts in North America and do some work on dust and dunes. And so I was like, yeah, sign me up. And it was more process oriented. So really kind of applied physics, contemporary processes, measuring sediment transport, fluid dynamics, all related to how we form and maintain dunes. And so my PhD was on that. And of course, when you graduate with a PhD, it's like, okay, now what am I going to do? I really like teaching. I got some good teaching experience during my PhD. Did a lot of teaching in kind of intro physical geography and geomorphology and aeolian and sediment transport. And so through my PhD process, I realized I'm really fascinated by the teaching process. And I think I'm good at it. I don't know, I don't have much experience, but I enjoy it. And so I had these two things, like teaching and research, that I really loved. And so that made the academic track seem obvious to me. But as it is today, it was very competitive. But I was fortunate to get a job on the West Coast in Canada, in Victoria. And at the time, I had a choice. I had three choices. I could go work for a consulting firm in the town where I finished my PhD, which is called Guelph, outside of Toronto. And that firm does wind loading on buildings, dust emissions, wind erosion. They're one of the biggest and best companies in the world. And I had a friend who was working for them, and I was kind of fascinated by that. So that was one option. Then I could do a postdoc if I'd wanted. So stay at Guelph and work with a coastal person who was on my committee, Robin Davidson Arnott, and do kind of coastal dunes and beach erosion. I thought that was pretty cool because yet again, I could broaden my interests and my experience and expertise. So I had this postdoc lined up, and then lo and behold, this job opportunity came up at UVic. So I interviewed for that, and I was like, oh, this is a pretty nice place, and these seem like nice people. So, and it's a real job. So, I'm gonna take that. So that's what I did. But I moved to the West Coast, and there was a big gap in terms of coastal geomorphology research generally on the coast. And in particular, people who work on that kind of coastal margin work, beaches and dunes or other deposits like bluffs behind the beach. So it was a good niche for me. I continued to work with the faculty who offered me a postdoc position, and we worked all across Canada and worked with some friends at the Geologic Survey. And so that's how I kind of came to this. And then after a few years at UVic, an opportunity came up at ASU, which I was pretty excited about, to do more desert work, which was great. And I inherited a wind tunnel, which is kind of exciting because I had a wind tunnel component to my PhD. And so made that move to ASU, and then very recently moved to University of California, Santa Barbara, where I'm back on the coast. There's eroding bluffs on campus. I'm, an hour and a bit away from one of my major study sites. And so, yeah, I mean, these opportunities take you in weird trajectories sometimes, but for me, it's always been about following that interest and what I'm good at. And that's the geomorphology of beaches and dunes and sediment transport and erosion and now restoration to bring it back. So there you go.
Awesome. No, thank you. So when you're working in restored or otherwise undisturbed, I guess undisturbed or disturbed dune systems, do you consider all of them to be a natural resource, or does that kind of change depending on the situation that you're working in?
Yeah, so I think for me, working in restoration has given me a broader perspective on what beaches and dunes really are. As a scientist, we look at them often, not always, but often in very narrow ways. There's a system, it's got some limits. We've got the ocean forcing erosion and water levels. We've got the beach storing sediment, providing sediment to the landward systems, whether they be estuaries or dune systems, doesn't matter. And so we look at it very systematically and clinically in a way. But I think, in the past decade or so, the science of things has become much more, two things, it's become more applied. And that's not to say everybody's doing applied research, but through our granting agencies, we have to consider things like broader impact for our work. So how is it relevant to society or management issues and so on? And that I agree with. I think that's a fantastic thing for scientists to be thinking about. How is your research useful? And the other thing is a lot of research this day and age, at least in my experience, is collaborative. So it requires not only that you be thinking about the broader impacts, but you be working with people on the ground who actually have to use your results to enact those broader impacts or help make them happen. So, again, I've benefited from working with so many public agencies over the years, mainly parks agencies, but lots of federal agencies and state agencies, provincial agencies to address an issue, and it's often a human environment issue. So what is it about this landscape of parks, beaches and dunes and rivers and estuaries that poses a challenge for management or for longer term resilience to things like climate change? And I think for me, it's kind of invigorated my excitement for the science of things. Once you've done this for a while, you sort of, you get good at it. You do the same things often, and then it's kind of like, well, what's next? And the last decade's been really exciting for that. Or the last 15 years, really, where we've seen federal initiatives in both Canada and the US to do national scale climate change impacts and adaptation studies to help municipalities and land management agencies identify vulnerable areas or activities and develop adaptation strategies to increase their resilience. It sounds easy to say, but it's hard to do because it involves often highly collaborative and community-based research. And that's something that as a PhD in geomorphology, you're not really trained to do. But I was trained in a geography program, not an earth sciences program, where we had people who specialized in natural resources management. So to get back to the point of the question, dunes as a resource, I think in geography programs, we learn often about the human environment interactions and how important those are for defining something as a resource. And so to me, something as a resource means, and there's a term that goes around that makes me a little uneasy because I'm not an economist, but the economists have fantastic ways to kind of quantify and identify ecosystem services. So something that specifically a landform or a component of the landscape or an ecosystem does that benefits humans or provides other resources. And so if you think about beaches and dunes, an obvious one is recreation opportunities. Everybody likes to go to the beach, or most people. I've yet to meet a person who doesn't like the beach, but I'm sure they're out there. Sand dunes, the same thing. There's an appeal to them. They're fascinating landscapes. They're like big sandboxes with vegetation and little nooks and crannies to hide in and play in if you're a kid, or if you're an adult and you like off-road vehicles, and there's opportunities for that as a recreation activity. But if you think about our indigenous cultures, these are landscapes that have been used for a variety of reasons for a long time, whether it be as lookouts or spiritual places or harvesting areas or areas where you collect kind of natural remedies and food. So, for thousands of years, beaches and dunes have been special places. We develop right up to the edge of them in urban areas because everybody wants the ocean view and the access to the beach. So yeah, dunes and beaches provide very important and a multitude of different ecosystem services. If you travel around the world, obviously there's tourism and recreation, but there are areas where dunes are planted with trees to stabilize them, but then those trees become a forestry resource. Dunes around the world, coastal dunes, provide a recharge zone for the groundwater table. So fresh water can percolate in and displace the seawater, which can serve ecosystems or wells in behind the forwarding system. They provide a buffer against erosion and flooding, which becomes increasingly important in developed areas and in areas where we have sea level rise and enhanced coastal erosion and flooding occurring. So that's just a handful of them, but you can imagine any landscape has this suite of things that we value. that we collectively would call an ecosystem service.
No, absolutely. And what are some of the threats to those dune systems that you interact with? And what sorts of impacts will those threats have on the ecosystem services that you kind of described here?
Right. Well, the threats, I mean, to me, they're obvious, but overdevelopment, urban development, or sometimes recreation use can be really intensive in ways that the system loses its resilience, or it loses its way to maintain its form and function against, that force, whether it be development, just bulldozing protective dunes, for example, or whether it be recreation activity that's too intense and destroys vegetation and compromises the ability of the system to maintain its form. So, and if you think about the function, this and the form of that ecosystem, that's where the ecosystem services lie. If you lose a foredune, you lose habitat for endangered and endemic or even local and valued species, right? And we have laws in North America that protect those species. So there are cases where, a dune system is protected in its entirety or for portions of the year for one species. And there are lots of debates on the value of that, but it's law. So if, for example, the Western snowy plover is nesting in an area, you don't go in there for a certain portion of the year. And thus that kind of protects a portion of the ecosystem function and value and services there. So I think humans are one of the big threats in these areas, because you'd be hard pressed to find, there are few and far between coastal dune ecosystems that don't have people in them or on them or developed right up to them. So these systems then, for the most part, are quite pressured and are limited in terms of their ability to be resilient. And I think the obvious second one is climate change. It's happening, we know this. Sea level is rising globally, in some areas faster than other areas. And the reasoning for that is manifold, but one of the main reasons is the crust is doing its own thing in relation or relative to a slow, gradual rise in water levels in the oceans, largely due to expansion of warmer water. So you have these crustal movements that can be up or down. If the crust is moving down and the ocean's moving up, then your rate of sea level rise is much higher than the global average. Or if the crust is moving up while the ocean's still moving up, if it's moving up faster, then you actually start to gain more coastal space, on the beaches and for the dunes. But those locations are few. So what we have is a combination of longer term sea level rise, so increasing that water level on our coastlines, with increasing storminess in many areas. There's recent work to show there's more frequent and perhaps more intense hurricanes happening. There's definitely changes in the storm tracking on the west coast of North America related to El Nino and La Nina. And so as these climate variability events, we call them, start to manifest themselves on shorelines, we tend to see more erosion, or at least more frequent events, maybe not higher in magnitude, that depends where you are. But it's about that regime again, the frequency and magnitude of events that remove sediment from the beach. And if they start to happen more frequently or with more magnitude or some combination, then we can lose these beaches and dune systems. Now they are resilient, I mentioned this before, they have the ability to rebuild very quickly. Often within a year of a big erosion event, much of the sediment can come back to the beach and start to rebuild the dune, and thus protect that buffering capacity and all those other ecosystem services. But there are areas where, if, for example, that response needs to take time or it needs to take space to occur, there are areas that are so developed that there is no area for the dune to move if it needs to. The expectation is as sea levels rise, beaches and dunes will migrate up and landward with that. And we've seen that in the geologic record. But you can imagine any developed beach you've been to in Southern California or along the east coast of the US, there's nowhere to go for these dunes, and they've become locked in, so to speak. So I think, those are the two biggest challenges, people and development, and of course, the climate change forcing.
Is there anything you think we can do to mitigate or manage those risks? And do you think that the interactions that people have with dune systems are going to change in the next 2 to 3 years, or even in the next couple of decades?
I'm hopeful. I'm an optimist. Again, I've seen national scale and state scale and provincial scale initiatives in my career, so 20 years or so, that are encouraging. They're going beyond assessing impacts to developing response strategies and longer term adaptation. And this is now becoming commonplace in terms of our coast. We've seen new reassessments of coastal flood risk by FEMA, so the Emergency Management Agency of the US, which then zones areas in terms of their risk to coastal flooding and erosion. And having that type of information at hand with good science and good monitoring is 75% of what municipalities and other land management agencies need to make more informed decisions on how to plan for sea level rise and increased storminess, for example. So I think that we're in a day and age now where there's been decades of work done on how beaches and dunes respond. We know how they respond. There's been a lot more recent work done on the implications and efficacy of restoring them so that they function a little more dynamically, as opposed to stabilized sand mound, or how we can implement and rebuild dunes when they've been eroded and try and allow those natural processes to build a resilient and sustainable dune system. So we have a lot more information now than we did 20 years ago. That said, we always seem to run into a couple hurdles or challenges when it comes to actually enacting this. It's one thing to do the studies and identify what can be done, but ultimately you need political buy-in and you need resourcing at the local level. And so the political buy-in relates to decision making, and this happens at the highest levels, right down to municipalities and even homeowner associations, and how they choose to respond or not to protect their properties. But if there's poor decision making or challenges in decision making to get to an effective response, nothing will get done, and this is one of the problems. And resourcing is important too. It's one thing to tell a community, listen, you need to restore your foredune, but it's costly. It takes time, it takes money, it takes effort, and it takes buy-in. So to me, those are the two biggest hurdles to getting to effective planning for climate change in the coastal zone, is how is it that we can overcome these human hurdles to deal with a real environmental problem. A huge percentage of our population globally, it's close to 80%, I believe, live along the coast or within 100 kilometers of a coastline. And many of these areas are subject to erosion and flooding. And that number is increasing. Everybody wants to retire to the coast or vacation on the coast or get a second home on the coast, and we understand the interest in wanting that, but the development pressures and the vulnerabilities and exposure associated with that is increasing, and thus are the risks. And the hazards are not declining in terms of their frequency and magnitude, as I mentioned before. So we end up with a situation where we have an incredibly narrow, highly valued stretch of land that is highly pressured, highly vulnerable in many ways in terms of the risks or things that you can lose in response to a natural hazard. But also, if left to its own devices, in many locations, not all, can be fairly resilient. And with engineering interventions, there are ways that we can design beaches to be a little more resilient and accommodate these changes too.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much. That's all I really have for you. I appreciate you giving your 2 cents. So thank you.
Yeah, no problem, Colin. Thanks.